This marriage is the best decision of your life. Adrian said it right as I was pouring more water into my glass. His voice wasn't warm or grateful. It carried that faint self-satisfaction, like he was quietly grading himself in front of me. I turned around. Adrian was leaning against the kitchen counter, arms crossed, his eyes curved in that way people get when they feel like they've won without having to compete. I've never been respected like this before. The sentence landed in the middle of the kitchen like something solid. It didn't hit me, but it bounced hard enough off the cold tile floor for me to feel it. I didn't say anything. Silence is always my choice when I need it. It lets me reveal nothing. Adrian sometimes mistakes it for agreement. Today, I let him keep thinking that. He thought he was bragging. But really, he was revealing something far more important. He wasn't talking to me. He was talking to someone else, or more precisely, about someone else. To understand that moment, I need to go back to the beginning. My name is Mara Holt. I work as a freelance graphic designer. My job has trained me to sit still for long stretches, observe carefully, and notice details other people miss. I'm not the type who needs the spotlight. I just need clarity. Adrian Cole, the man I married, works in media management. He's good with words. Very good. So good that sometimes I think if he ever said the sky was red, he could convince a few people it was true. Adrian carries a kind of confidence that looks attractive on the surface, but feels sharp underneath, the kind that can curl into a need to exaggerate when necessary. In the early days, he often mentioned his messy past with his ex-wife. The story always felt like a heavily edited film, only scenes where he played the one who endured. Brielle, his ex-wife, appeared only in vague outlines, like someone standing behind a curtain. We just weren't compatible, he once said over dinner. No emotion, no bitterness, just a strangely final tone. I didn't ask for more. To me, everyone's past deserves some privacy. But over time, one thing became clearer. He always needed to prove that his life was moving upward, not in an ambitious way, but in a comparative one, as if every step forward he took needed someone else to be stepping backward for it to mean anything. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was a habit left over from a bad marriage. But then there were signs that were no longer subtle. One Friday night, we met up with a group of Adrian's mutual friends at a small bar. Yellow lights, music at just the right volume, everything normal until someone in the group asked, "So how's Brielle doing these days? I heard she's working on something in cosmetics?" Just one sentence. But Adrian's expression shifted instantly. A blink too fast for anyone else to notice, but not fast enough to get past me. He smiled, but it tilted to one side, stiff in a way that felt slightly off. "Oh, she's the same as always," he said, his tone carefully casual. "Nothing worth talking about." No one paid much attention, but I did. That brief passing tension didn't come from pain. It felt more like fear of the past being brought up, or worse, fear that the past no longer stayed beneath his feet, exactly where he needed it to be. On the way home, I didn't ask. Adrian didn't say anything either. Something about that moment made me fall a few steps behind, watching him from a different angle. Someone who's truly happy doesn't flinch when they hear an ex's name. Someone who's truly let go doesn't need to adjust their smile to look indifferent. From that night on, the small pieces started to come together. Adrian often said things like, "I've never felt this respected before being with you. You make me feel like I'm finally on the right path." On the surface, it sounded sweet, but then I realized those weren't compliments meant for me. They were things he was saying to himself. And for those words to mean anything, someone else had to be standing on the opposite side. Someone named Brielle. By this point, I can clearly name what I felt after months of living with Adrian. He showed off this marriage not because he felt lucky. He showed it off because he needed to win this marriage over the one before it. Not the biggest secret, but the first straight line that cast its long shadow. I didn't know the full truth yet. Standing in the kitchen, watching Adrian take pride in himself like he was being handed a medal, I only knew one thing. If a man needs to talk too much about being respected, then maybe he's never truly respected anyone at all. And that was when I started paying attention. Just paying attention. But sometimes, that small act of attention is exactly what opens the door for every truth that comes crashing in later. After that evening, I started seeing Adrian in a different light. Not full suspicion, but the kind of light that reveals cracks I hadn't stood close enough to notice before. And the more I observed, the more I realized something hard to swallow. Those small injustices had been there all along. I had just gotten used to brushing them aside to keep the peace. It started with a comment that seemed harmless. One Monday morning, while I was sending design files to a client, Adrian glanced at my screen and shrugged. Graphic design, it's more like something you do for fun, right? There was no obvious sting in it. It felt like a light touch, but it hit the right nerve. I didn't respond. What I saw wasn't ignorance. It was dismissal. A kind of dismissal so familiar to him that he didn't even recognize it as wrong. Adrian liked to talk about his job by casting himself as the backbone. Every meeting, every campaign was so difficult only he could handle it. Every compliment at work proved he was different. He wasn't loud or obvious about it. Adrian was more subtle than that. He showed off by letting people reach the conclusion on their own that he mattered, that without him, everything around him would fall apart. And me. Sometimes he used me as proof. Look at us, stable, mature. I know what's good for me. He said that one evening at dinner with his coworkers. On the surface, it sounded harmless, but I understood what it meant. This marriage was the medal he wore to prove his life was on the right track. Those small injustices didn't hurt right away. They were like thin cuts, almost invisible, but over time they started to show color. What was strange was that whenever those pieces appeared, Brielle seemed to surface in the conversation indirectly. Once, when our group of friends was talking about her, someone described Brielle as quiet and reserved. It was a neutral description, but Adrian cut in immediately, his voice carrying a hint of a smile without any warmth. She has no ambition. I looked at him, and for the first time, I clearly saw the tone he used when talking about his ex. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't regret. It was belittlement. A top-down judgment, as if he were erasing her role from his life by making her seem small. I asked him, "How do you know that?" Adrian just shrugged. I lived with her for 4 years. I would know. There was no further explanation, but I could see the intention clearly. The small turning point came on an evening that was as still as water. I was watching an entertainment show on my laptop when Adrian walked into the room and leaned against the doorway. He looked at me for a few seconds, then said something out of nowhere. "Don't ever become like her." I looked up. Like who? He didn't say her name. He didn't need to. His voice was cold and flat, as if what he said was an objective truth. No context, no reason, just a warning disguised as advice. In that moment, for the first time, I felt myself take a step back emotionally. A question surfaced in my mind, sharp as a blade. Was he trying to turn himself into the victim? Or did he break her down first, and now it was my turn? That question didn't make me angry. It made me clear. Then there was another night, when I went to pick Adrian up from a meetup with old friends. He was drunker than usual, talking more than he normally did. The friend with him, also half drunk, leaned on Adrian's shoulder and burst out laughing. "Remember when you used to say Brielle would never amount to anything? Looking back, that's pretty funny." I stood a few steps away, close enough to hear every word. Adrian flinched and tugged his friend's arm, signaling him to stop, but it was already too late. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask. I just looked at Adrian the way you look at a shadow caught in bright light, and I saw the parts of him exposed, the parts he tried hardest to hide. He had belittled Brielle, not once, not by accident. And my silence in that moment wasn't because I didn't understand. It was because everything was now so clear that no explanation was needed. When we got home, Adrian fell asleep on the couch right away. I stood there watching him for a few seconds. There was no anger, no tenderness, just a strange calm inside me, like someone had placed the final piece into a picture I never wanted to finish. That was when I understood the real twist of this phase. Adrian didn't just have a tendency to belittle women. He had done it to Brielle before. And now, that same pattern was starting to repeat. Slowly, piece by piece, with me. It wasn't because I was being sensitive. It wasn't because I was overthinking. It was because the truth was revealing itself layer by layer. I knew that from this point on, things wouldn't be able to hold on to that initial sense of calm anymore. But I stayed quiet. Not because I accepted it, but because I wanted to see where the truth would go on its own. And when the truth starts to surface, it always does so in ways no one expects. My silence after that night didn't make Adrian suspicious. It only made him more comfortable, as if he believed the pieces I had seen still weren't enough to form the full picture. But when someone grows too used to hearing their own version of the story, they often forget that the truth always finds a way to appear from places they can't control. One Sunday afternoon, we went to a birthday party for a mutual friend. The atmosphere was loud but easygoing. I chose to stand near the drinks table because it was the perfect place to listen without drawing attention. Adrian was talking with two old friends in the backyard. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but when a voice came up and mentioned Brielle's name, my instincts made me stop. I swear, back then Adrian used to talk about Brielle like she was a burden. One of them chuckled, his voice loud enough to cut through the crowd. Her little company couldn't even make $50. You remember that? The other one laughed. Of course. Every time we hung out, he complained that she had no future. I felt each sentence land like a heavy stone, but not because it hurt. It was because I was hearing the truth from a source Adrian couldn't control. He was standing right there between them, forcing a smile, motioning for them to lower their voices. But people who are slightly drunk don't know how to hold back. One of them clapped Adrian on the shoulder and said it like a compliment. But hey, it all worked out. You chose the right new one. I watched the scene from a distance. It felt like rewatching a film where the director accidentally left in the behind-the-scenes footage. No flattering lighting, no background music, just raw truth. And what made my chest go cold wasn't what they said. It was the fact that Adrian had never told me anything like this. What he gave me was always an edited version. He was the one who endured, and Brielle was the one who just didn't fit. And the truth? He had mocked her. He had belittled her efforts. He had turned his former marriage into a place where he stood tall and she stood small, so he could walk away still feeling like he had won. And I couldn't ignore what was becoming clear. He was starting to build the same story with me. On the way home, Adrian kept talking about the party, but his version of the night was completely different from the one I had heard. He said people still liked him, still remembered him, still asked about his work and his marriage. He didn't mention Brielle, not a single word. I didn't interrupt his story. I just let what I had heard settle into its proper place. And as the pieces began to fit, I finally saw what had once been only a vague feeling. It wasn't about being incompatible. It wasn't about wounds from a past marriage. It was about how Adrian operates. He talks about women using the same formula, pushing them down so he can lift himself up. That realization didn't weigh my heart down. It woke me up, so awake that every sound around me seemed to fade into the background. The real turning point came on a Wednesday morning, when I was pouring myself a glass of water and Adrian's phone kept ringing. He was in the shower. So I only saw the screen light up. 3 messages from the same old friend, then a notification from a local news outlet. It wouldn't have stood out if not for the headline sitting right there on the screen. Local cosmetics startup set to be acquired for millions of dollars. Founder, Brielle Carter. I stood still, not shocked, not happy. I just felt the air in the kitchen shift slightly, as if the world had quietly rebalanced a scale Adrian believed had already been locked in place. Adrian walked out of the bathroom with a towel around his shoulders. When he saw me looking at his phone, he asked, "Something wrong?" I held the screen out to him. No words, no eye contact, just handed it over. He took it. There was a moment, very brief, when his face went pale, like he'd suddenly lost gravity. Then he adjusted his expression, forcing a smile his lips couldn't quite keep up with. "Oh, good for her," Adrian said, his voice catching slightly. "Guess she finally managed to make something work." That sentence told me exactly what he was afraid of. Afraid of being seen as wrong. Afraid of his true nature being exposed. Afraid that the things he had said would be pulled back up from the mud. His phone vibrated again. A new message from his former boss. "Looks like you misjudged her." I caught a glimpse of it. So did Adrian. Just one short line, but enough to knock down the entire wall he had built around himself. He set the phone down on the kitchen counter and took a deep breath, like he was trying to steady himself. Then he said the familiar line, "Good thing I chose the right new person." I didn't respond. I just looked at him. No anger, no pity, just watching, like I was seeing a mask loosen as water peeled it away. And I could clearly see that what was underneath wasn't confidence. It wasn't pride. It was fear. The fear that the truth he tried to bury was finally surfacing. And surfacing at the exact moment he believed he was standing at his highest point. Adrian had once spoken about Brielle with deep contempt. And the person he dismissed the most became the one he could no longer reach. Nothing else needed to be said. No confrontation from me. No argument. The truth had spoken for itself, in the way it chose to, and the only thing I needed to do now was stand still, see everything clearly, before stepping into what came next, where the truth was no longer in Adrian's hands, but in mine. If there's ever a moment that reveals someone struggling to keep their balance, it's the moment when they believe everything around them is still under their control. After the news that Brielle was about to become a millionaire, Adrian went quiet for 1 day, then 2. By the 3rd day, he started showing off again, as if he needed to compensate for a loss he couldn't bring himself to admit. And that led to the family gathering on Saturday night. Adrian's sister's house was always brightly lit, crowded, and just noisy enough. I stood near the salad table, listening to conversations overlap and weave together. Adrian was in the middle of the living room, exactly where he liked to be. Not the center, but close enough that people would turn and check in with him. When I stepped closer, I heard him say the familiar line, in the same tone that had stopped me cold in the kitchen weeks earlier. "This marriage is the best decision of my life." He said it in front of 3 aunts and a few cousins, his voice locked into that carefully polished confidence, like he'd just signed another successful contract. Someone asked, "You mean more stable than before?" Adrian smiled. Stable, peaceful, and most importantly, respected. I knew that line wasn't meant for them. It was meant for a shadow standing outside this house. A message wrapped in casual certainty, sent to Brielle, or to the version of her he had created in his mind. He emphasized peaceful, respected, as if he were reading from a description meant to contrast with his ex, lifting himself up through that opposition. I stood a few steps behind him. I didn't speak. I didn't interrupt. I just observed with a level of calm so sharp I could feel its edge myself. There are moments when you realize you're no longer silent for the sake of peace. You're silent to see how far you've already come. And that night, I knew I had reached the point where I couldn't stay still anymore. I wasn't defending Brielle. I wasn't there to restore the dignity of a woman I had never sat down and spoken with. I spoke for myself. Because I understood clearly that I was now the next person in the cycle Adrian believed no one could see through. He bragged to place himself in the winning position. But standing in front of me, after everything I had witnessed, all I saw was a man afraid of being measured against the truth. I stepped forward one pace, just enough for everyone in the room to notice me. Adrian turned around, his smile pausing slightly at the corners of his mouth. "You see," he said. "Here, I cut him off. Calm, brief, cold. You can belittle her as much as you want, but the truth is this. The person you look down on the most is the one who left you the farthest behind." There was nothing more. One sentence, the truth standing on its own, needing no explanation. The room froze, like someone had just turned the music off. A few people looked at Adrian, then at me, then back at Adrian. No one laughed. No one tried to smooth it over. No one rushed to push the discomfort into another topic. I didn't turn away. I didn't look anyone in the eye. I let the sentence stay there in the air, like a mirror reflecting an image no one could deny. Adrian looked at me like he didn't recognize the person standing in front of him. Not because I had changed, but because he had never imagined I could see everything. He stood still, his shoulders sinking just slightly, barely noticeable, but enough for me to see that he had just lost the thing he cared about most. His position. Not because Brielle was rich, not because she had won, but because he had been exposed in the one place he feared the most, in front of the people he wanted to keep believing in his perfect image. One of his aunts spoke up, her voice slow. "Adrian, do you want to explain?" He opened his mouth, then closed it. I saw the tendon in his neck twitch, the sign of someone trying to gather a story, but for the first time, having no story left to save him. A minute of silence stretched long enough for everyone to sense there was something deeper than they had known. No one defended him. No one accused me. They just looked at him, waiting for what he couldn't say. I didn't add anything else, not because I was backing down, but because one honest sentence is always enough. Anything after that only dilutes the truth. I stepped back from the center of the room, leaving Adrian standing there alone, under the weight of eyes piecing together things they had seen before, but never connected. I didn't feel satisfied. I didn't feel like I had won. I only felt balance return to where it belonged. Exposure isn't humiliation. It isn't about making someone lose face. That's when the truth stands up on its own legs, and the person who hid it has nowhere left to turn. That night, Adrian didn't lose me. He lost the power he believed he had always held. And that was when I knew the next part no longer belonged to him. It belonged to my decision, and that decision was drawing closer, step by step, breath by breath, through every silence I held onto until I left the room. The room after my words turned cold in a very real way. Not because of the weather, but because everyone inside could hear two things at once: the truth and the void it left behind. Adrian stood there, trying to steady his breathing, and I knew I had reached the point where I didn't need to stand still anymore. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I simply walked over to the chair, picked up my coat, and slipped it over my shoulders as if the air outside had turned chilly. No one stopped me. No one asked where I was going. I stood up in a silence thin as a blade, not to humiliate Adrian, but because I knew staying even one more minute would mean betraying myself. When I turned my back, Adrian finally moved. He took a few steps toward me, his voice slipping just enough to reveal what he was trying to hide. "Mara, wait." I didn't stop, but I didn't walk too fast either. I gave him the chance to finish whatever he thought might save the situation. He did exactly what I expected. He clung to an excuse. I didn't mean any harm, Adrian said, his voice rushed but still trying to sound composed. I just want to feel respected. You know that. I turned back slightly, just enough to see him standing in the living room light, smaller, more worn, as if what had just cracked hadn't only hit his pride, but the very thing he'd been using to build his image all along. I just want to be respected. The sentence landed the way hollow metal hits tile. It made noise, but carried no weight. Then, like every time he felt power slipping away, Adrian shifted roles so fast I could see how practiced it was. I've been misunderstood so many times, he continued. I'm not a bad person. I'm disappointed about the past. I went through a lot. I listened. No arguing, no sighing, no sympathy. I could see it clearly. Adrian wasn't looking for the truth. He was looking for a role that would let him stand taller one more time. Even if it meant playing the victim, he would take it, as long as it kept him from the place the truth was pulling him toward. I stepped closer, not to comfort him, but to say my final line clearly. I'm not here to be turned into the next version of someone else. My voice wasn't raised. It didn't shake. It wasn't sad. It was simply the truth, standing firmly on the ground. Adrian's face changed instantly, not with anger, but with the realization of something he may have never considered. I saw him more clearly than he thought, and I was no longer afraid of what I saw. He reached out as if to stop me, but let his hand fall after touching nothing but the space between us, a space I would never step back into again. I turned and walked toward the door. No one in the room said a word. That silence wasn't awkwardness, it was witnessing. I opened the door and wrapped my hand around the metal handle. It was cold, but not as cold as the truth I had just spoken, not as cold as what I was leaving behind. I heard Adrian's footsteps, then I heard him stop. He knew that some doors, once closed, can't be called back by any sound loud enough. I walked out of the party without looking back. The hallway air rushed past me, carrying the smell of wood and late-season evening, as if the space itself were widening to let me pass. I didn't just leave the party. I left the marriage. I left the way Adrian used women as mirrors to reflect himself. I left the cycle he believed he could place on one person after another without anyone seeing it. I left without an announcement, without packing a suitcase right away, without delivering a final definitive line. I only needed to step out of the orbit Adrian had built for himself and let it spin back into the empty space where he stood alone. When I reached the last step, I heard the door close behind me. Not hard, not soft, just enough to tell me that my chapter with Adrian had ended with exactly what I wanted, a silence stronger than any explanation. Outside, the yard was a little darker. Yellow streetlights stretched across the pavement like a thin line dividing old from new. I stepped over it, and for the first time in months, I took a long, full breath, not to calm myself, but to feel that I had just walked away from something that no longer deserved me. Empowerment isn't revenge. It isn't winning. It isn't standing above someone else. Empowerment is knowing exactly when to leave, and leaving with a steady, cold step, without looking back. I walked straight toward my car, one hand still holding my coat, my mind clear. No regret, no fear. No thoughts about what Adrian might be saying behind my back, because from that moment on, his words no longer shaped any part of my life. The car door closed, a small sound, but it was the sound that opened an entire chapter of life I would write for myself, not the one someone else wanted me to play a role in. And in that exact moment, I knew I was free from all of it. And I didn't need to go back to confirm that. Respect doesn't come from words. It comes from how someone treats you when no one is watching, and from your willingness to leave when you know you deserve more. Sometimes Strength isn't in responding. It's in the calm step you take as you walk away from a place that no longer belongs to you. That's where the story ends. Thank you for listening all the way through. If it were you, would you stay with someone who needs to put others down just to feel tall? I'd really love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Thank you for being here and for the support that means more than anything I could put into words.